here, your Thrifty Apprentice. Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome back to another Thrifty review. First, let me apologize for the reflection of the setup in the box. Unfortunately, it's just going to be the way it is for just a few minutes, and we'll move through this as quickly as possible. In today's quick review, we are going to be taking a look at Paul Ruben's Opaque Watercolor Paint. This is a 36 color set, 15 milliliter tubes. Before I get into the actual review, we are going to jump into a demo so that you can see the paints in use one final time before I offer you my final opinion on the product. So I hope you all really enjoyed that demo and that it gave you a chance to see the paints in use. I will be linking some other videos that I use the paints in, so that you guys can go back and check them out if you would like to. Let's move through this little quick unboxing really quickly so I can get the reflection of the camera setup out of the top of the box. So I already said that it was the Paul Ruben Opaque Watercolor. There's 36 colors. Each tube is 15 milliliters. Rich color, fine pigment particles, good light fastness, bright coverage. And then it does have Paul Ruben's, old logo. They have changed logo recently. I'm not sure exactly when it was, but their new packaging carries a different logo, a different looking logo than the eye that we saw there. Flipping the box over on the back, you're going to get a lot of information that is in different languages. The same thing that it said on the front cover: rich color, fine pigment particle, good light fastness, better coverage. There are 2 QR codes here that I tried to use my phone to research, but both of them took me to sites that weren't really working. There's information listed in Chinese, but what you can make out is what I assume is a phone number, the website for A1's Art, which is the company that produces and manufactures this particular product. And then there's a UPC code. Now, I did not see any information that led me to a Lightwish site. And if you do not know, Lightwish is the distributor of most of the A1's Art products here in the United States. They do have a website, and if you go on to Amazon to look for Paul Ruben's, you will find that a lot of their products are sold by Lightwish, which again is the distributor, for the Paul Ruben's and A1's Art's products here in the United States. It's a cool site to go check out. So that's pretty much the box, straightforward. Let's go ahead and pull this open. When you flip over in the box, it's a really nice thick cardboard box. I feel like it is really meant to protect the paint. Now mine was a little dinged up here, but that's because of Amazon delivery that had nothing to do with the manufacturer or the distributor, I don't believe. Inside the box, you're going to get a pamphlet, just a little straightforward pamphlet. It has color swatching, the 12 color selection, the 24 color selection, the 36 color selection. And then there are, just kind of images of the paints in use, but everything on here is pretty much in Chinese, other than the exact same information from the front and the back of the box that was written in English. Again, just same information that's on the box that you can make out, and that is the telephone number that I was referring to. Introduction. It is made of high quality toner and natural gum. The pigment texture is smooth, uniform, and consistent, which can create regular backgrounds, good coverage, and excellent color rendering. It is suitable for images that want to express opacity or a more intense and rich image. And of course, we know they're called opaque watercolors because the pigment particles inside an opaque watercolor are ground more coarsely. They're a little heavier than in a traditional watercolor. And because of the way those pigments are treated, it makes the paints more opaque or less see-through, less transparent, as most of your transparent paints are on the market today. So there's a cushion in here to cover the tubes. And then you get to your color selection, which I've rearranged the tubes. This is not the order that they came in, but this is the order that I panned them in as well as swatched them in. So each tube, as you can see, is a 15 milliliter tube. So you are going to get quite a bit of paint in each one of them. It is aluminum based, and it does contain the color number and the name in English on each tube, which is really beneficial because all of the other information is in Chinese. Now, what sets this apart from the Paul Ruben's Guaca paints, which is the last Paul Ruben sets that we recently reviewed, is that this does have some English translation on it to make it a little bit easier for the Western audience. So the tube says, again, the color name, the number. There are 5 stars on each tube, which I assume was supposed to be indicative of the light fast rating, but I do remember from doing the translation research on the guaca paints that the 5 stars does not necessarily mean that it was given 5 stars. And there is a difference in translation depending on what translator you use. And of course, just based on that, there may be difference in information provided. So I just kind of use my best educated guess with a lot of this. They do conform to the EN 71-3 regulation. It lets you know that they're made in China. So that's pretty much the tube. It's got a screw off top, which was pretty easy to open. There was no foil covering the neck of each one. I did shake each of the paints before I decided to pan them, just to make sure that there wasn't any binder pigment separation. Now, for all intents and purposes, there was not much. I did not have a hard time panning these like I did the Paul Ruben Opaque paints. But there is like some very, very big differences. As of course, you guys know those Opaque paints I told you were more of a hybrid, where these are considered a watercolor, just an opaque watercolor, because of how coarsely the pigments in each of the paints are ground and the ratio of binder. So that's kind of what you get with the tubes. The tubes were not hard to squeeze. The paint came out pretty easily. Some of them are a little bit more watery in consistency than others, but overall pretty decent panning experience in a very nice range of colors that are going to give you a much more opaque feel than your traditional watercolor. So let's move on and look at how I pan them. Now, I'm not sure if you guys remember, but this is that Maya Hemi 36 count solid watercolor set that I reviewed months back. I'll be sure to try to link it if I can remember. Those paints, they painted out pretty well, but I hated the way that they dried and cracked. So I repurposed the palette by removing those paints. And it's in this palette that I decided to pan the 36 opaque watercolors, because I did have 36 wells here. Well, the paints did crack when they dried down, which was really surprising to me, because this was considered an opaque watercolor, and they really dried down and gave me crackage like more of a student grade gouache would versus a professional range watercolor. And I found it really funny because the Paul Ruben's Opaque paints dried down in the palette without any cracking at all. And if anything, those hybrid paints would be the ones that I would expect to crack more than, say, one that was labeled an official watercolor. So I'm just going to show you guys what I mean here. If you remember, this was the packaging for the Opaque paints, and I panned them here. I am going to link this video if I haven't already mentioned that. And as you can see, these paints, although I had a terrible panning experience and some of the consistency seemed really off to me, when they dried down with a much more solid, non-cracking consistency, other than the ones where I had a little bit of the binder separation issue with. So as far as panning and staying whole in the pan, I think the Opaque paints work a little bit better than these opaque watercolors. But of course, that doesn't depict the performance of the paints per se. So let's just get into that. I did want to show you the way that they were panned, and I did want you to see that a lot of them did crack in the palette. As you can see, they will remove and fall out of the palette, and they remind me so much of a gouache in this aspect, especially a student grade gouache that will crack and fall out of the palette. So that was definitely something to keep in mind about the paints as I explored them. So of course I swatched the paints out here, and I did swatch them on the 100% cotton watercolor paper that I normally swatch my professional grade paints on. I said earlier it was a really nice range of colors, and as you can see here, I did 3 different sort of washes. There's a really watery wash. I went back and did a glaze with a consistency of paint with less water, and then of course I did a mass tone glaze, mainly because I was trying to see the type of opacity that you could build by layering the paints. And I don't know if you guys can really see the black line on some of them. it's a bit more transparent than others, and then on some of them it's really thick, and you can see that there's a lot of sedimentation and that the pigments are definitely bigger, causing more opacity, especially the more you layer. The lighter colors that seem like they have, like, say, more white mixed into them, of course have more opacity. Now, of course, with them being an opaque watercolor, and in my opinion leaning more to the side of gouache, I feel like a lot of these paints have an undisclosed white in them, which helps to make them a little bit more opaque, you know, like maybe an opacifier in them. And of course, I don't know the complete formulation of these paints, but this is just my speculation based on testing them and using them. You have some pretty decent blues. I noticed that there were a lot of warm colors, but some really pretty beautiful colors that I was able to do some pretty decent painting with. I really hate that I don't know for sure the light fastness of these, and for that very reason I would, you know, suggest sketchbook use, or use in situations where you were going to be reproducing it. And again, reminding me of a gouache, because gouache is typically a designer's choice, especially for stuff that's going to be reproducing. I can see these being used in that aspect. So that's just a swatch, and that's what it looked like. Of course, I did another swatching sheet here, just a sort of mass tone in order to go into my palette so I could keep up with what the colors look like after being dried down, re-wet, and repainted. Now, I will say that they re-wet really, really well. Just like the guaca paints, these re-wet so easily, just like the slightest touch of a damp brush, and you will have, you know, you'll have some paints. And I'm just gonna grab a brush here just so you guys can see, and I'm just gonna, you know, that's just a brush that I pulled right out of my water bucket, and you see how that reactivated that quick. That is beautiful reactivation. The colors are really bright and saturated, but it is more like a gouache, so they do dry down with a pretty matte feel, and because of that they do lose a little luster upon drying, but it's not huge, it's not really, really big. Of course, I did some color mixing with them because I wanted to test their color mixing ability, keeping in mind that they are an opaque watercolor, and the thicker a paint is, the more opacifiers in it, or the more heavily ground the pigments are, they can tend to mix into mud quicker than a more transparent watercolor. So I really wanted to test for those type of things. So I decided to actually do 3 different color wheels: a warm, a cool, and a split. So for the warm, I used the vermilion, the chrome yellow, and the ultramarine, since all 3 of those colors are in the warm family. And they gave me some pretty decent mixtures, a really deep violet purple here. The green was more of a olivey type of green. I could see it being used in landscapes. And then the orange, a little bit duller than I'm used to, but for all intents and purposes, it was pretty cool orange. They make really nice secondary colors, mixing the cool primaries together. The warm primaries together. And the gray is decent, although mixing warm primaries do not give me the most saturated gray. And I'm really a fan of making my own gray from either using Prussian blue and burnt sienna or burnt umber, or using ultramarine for those. Of course, if you use ultramarine, you're going to get some of your more neutral gray, and if you use Prussian blue, you get more of your Payne's gray tone. I think they're both really pretty. So next I did a cool mixture wheel using magenta, lemon yellow, and cerulean. Again, they gave pretty decent mixtures. That color choice really reminds me a lot of those primary mixing gouache sets. For instance, like the Lucas Studio gouache set, you're going to get a red, a yellow, and a blue, and the blue in it is more of a cyan leaning blue, which is what cerulean really reminds me of. You get some really decent secondary colors. I really like the green that you can mix from the cerulean blue and the lemon yellow. The violet is a little bit more on the lighter side, maybe a little bit duller in my opinion, you get from the warm mixing primaries, but it's still a very pretty color that can be used with no issues. And the orange is not necessarily my favorite, but you can tell it's orange, and I do see that I can see where it could be used in a lot of different situations. This gray, a little bit more, of course it has more of a cooler tone, and I tend to lean more so towards cooler grays than I do warmer grays, but this is just me and my preference. And then finally, I did the type of mixing wheel that I typically do with you guys, which is a split primary, where I use both warm and cool primaries in order to mix the secondaries. Here I use magenta, lemon yellow, and ultramarine. Of course, magenta and lemon yellow being cool colors, and ultramarine being my warm color, giving me a split primary mixing palette here. This is my favorite mixing palette. These are the colors I tend to lean towards more, and run towards more. However, with this particular set, I have to say that I got clean secondary mixtures regardless of the temperature of the primaries that I was using. So in that aspect, I was really pleased to know that regardless of whether you are someone who wants to just paint straight using convenient colors without mixing, or someone who likes to mix and more into color theory, whether you lean more so towards a warm mixing palette, towards a cool mixing palette, or towards a split primary mixing palette, regardless of the choice, you're going to get really clean mixed colors. Thought that was absolutely phenomenal. Let's move on and look at some of the artwork that I did with them. Real quick, there wasn't like a lot done. I used them, of course, in the demo that we did on the video today. And I am trying to find the sketchbook. Here we go. I used them in a video not too long ago, which I did some mylar balloons for New Year's. Let's see, it was the first video of this year, if I can find it. Here we go. So this is the first one I did, where I did mylar balloons, where I really wanted to see if I could achieve giving it that really shiny metallic look. And I think for all intents and purposes, it turned out well. The paints did shift a little bit more than I like, and I think they shift a little bit more than the guaca paints do, actually. Yet and still, I was able to pull off the effects I needed in order to give the composition a shine and make it look like they were shiny mylar balloons. Of course, the composition that I did today in the video, I kind of want to share a dessert with you guys. You know, I really like painting glass, and I really wanted to know how this would work in that situation. Since I typically use a more transparent medium in order to paint glass, I wanted to see if I could still get that same transparent, shiny effect from a more opaque watercolor versus something that I knew was more transparent. And I think that the paints worked really well in this aspect. I was able to control the lightness and achieve the depth all at the same time to give me the feel of actually looking through glass to see the little Sunday moose that I painted. So real good. I didn't do too much with them. I really just kind of wanted to test them out just to get a feel for them. As far as an opaqueness concerned, I did figure that they would lean more so towards gouache, and they did. They lift pretty well. I didn't have any issues with lifting anything out, which I don't have the standard lift test or salt test for these particular paints. I have found that with mediums that have heavier pigments in them, they don't tend to react to the salt test as well as a more transparent, finely ground pigment paint will. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But overall, this wasn't going to be too long. It's really just kind of straightforward. At the end of the day, I think the paints are pretty cool. They do remind me so much more of a gouache than they do a watercolor, and I understand that. Now, the Paul Ruben line itself that I know of doesn't produce a gouache. So the opaque watercolors or the hybrid guaca paints that we were just looking at will probably be the closest you could get from a gouache with them. These paints are decent and they're okay. I have to say, in all honesty, they aren't my favorite, but you can paint with them. You can make some really cool compositions. They will work watery, or they will work more mass tone to create a more gouache type effect. I do not care for the way that they crack down in the palette. So if you're going to dry them out versus painting directly from the tube with them. Make sure that you are painting them in a palette where the walls come all the way to the top so that your paint won't fall out and shuffle around. If you should happen to bump your palette, drop your palette, get it turned upside down in a travel bag or something of that nature. So there you have that. The paints currently are running $59.99 on lightwish.com, which is their distributor's website. And you can also get the 36 color set for, well, it's currently listed for $77.42 on AliExpress. So if you were interested in getting them, I definitely suggest that you get them from the Lightwish website. They are no longer currently available on Amazon, but I'm going to put all 3 links in the video description so that you can check them out. Maybe they'll pop back up on Amazon, but in the meantime, if you're interested in adding them to your art collection, I would definitely suggest sourcing them from the lightwish.com site, where you're going to pay about 60 bucks for them. Now the question becomes, are they worth 60 bucks? And I have to honestly say, after using them, I'm not necessarily sure I would pay $60 for these, especially when I know that the Paul Ruben's guac eye paints run the same price range. And overall, I think that the guac eye paint is a better product. This is just my opinion based on the way they dry down in the palette and the use. You pretty much kind of get the same feel with the paints based on use, but I give the guac eye paints the edge based on the consistency, the way they dry down, and just the fact that they don't crack and fall out of the palette as much. Outside of that, I really don't think that there is a huge difference between the guac eye paints and the opaque watercolor set. I think they sort of were made for the same market. They sort of have the same feel, that whole gouache product that can be used as watercolor, but is probably meant for a thicker application, giving you more of a designer gouache feel. You know, that's just this. So I would have to say that both the guac eye paints and the opaque watercolor paints both remind me of a gouache, or lean more so towards a gouache in my opinion than they do a watercolor. And if I had to choose between the Paul Ruben's opaque set and the guac eye set, I would choose the guac eye set, although this is not a bad choice. So I just wanted to kind of leave you guys with that information. Of course, I expect that you guys will make the best decision for your pocket, the way you paint, your style of artistry, and what works best for you. And hopefully I've provided some information that'll make it a little bit easier for you to make that decision. So there you have it, guys. Hopefully you heard, saw, picked up on something that is going to be useful or helpful to you, or you enjoyed the painting demo. If you did, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Go ahead and subscribe if you're new to the channel, or if you're returning and you haven't subscribed, hit that notification bell so you'll know when the new content comes out. This entire week is going to be a week of reviews. So both today, Friday, and Saturday, I'm going to be reviewing products that I've been using a little bit since before Christmas, because we're going into the new year and I want to get some new things started. Hit up the comment section. Let me know, what do you think of this review? Have you used these paints? Have you used the guac eye paints? How do you feel that they compare against each other? I personally like the guac eye paints a little bit more than the opaque watercolor, just based on my art style. You can hit up the video description. You're going to find relevant links for the Facebook group where we do all things artsy and crafty. You're going to find links for the most recommended product list, which unfortunately this one didn't make that list. And then you're going to also find links for the Etsy shop and the Patreon shop, where you can support the channel if you decide to. Thank you guys so much, because the proceeds that are made from those are the things that I use to continue to buy these products in order to bring you guys the reviews and the field tests and the demos and all of that great things. So thanks so much for the support for those who do. I really, really appreciate it so very much. All right, guys, there you have it. Thank you so much for joining me for another video. And remember, as I tell you at the end of each one, just keep painting and crafting.